EWA Radio, a podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm public editor and your host, Kavitha Cardoza. A few weeks ago, Samantha Shapiro wrote Young and Homeless in Rural America for the New York Times Magazine. It's a piece about the significant number of homeless students in rural America. The people she introduced us to are trying so hard, the obstacles are so overwhelming, and the statistics so bleak. She writes, homeless students have the worst educational outcomes of any group, the lowest attendance, the lowest scores on standardized tests, the lowest graduation rates. They all face the same cruel paradox. Students who do not have a stable place to live are unable to attend school regularly, and failing to graduate from high school is the single greatest risk factor for future homelessness. But there's hope. In one sentence, Samantha writes, in rural areas, schools can be an island of resources. We're delighted to welcome Samantha Shapiro to the podcast today. Samantha, thank you so much for making time to chat with us about your piece.
Thank you for having me.
You were an EWA Reporting Fellow. I've just got to say that up front. And needless to say, all of us are super proud of you and this piece.
Yes, and I'm so grateful for the support that the organization gave, because reporting a really long, complicated piece like this, you just need extra support, and it really made a big difference, and I'm very grateful for that.
You've been interested in homelessness for some time now in your writing, right?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what you've done in the past.
Well, I got interested in the subject when my son's best friend from kindergarten became homeless in the first grade, and sort of the process began unfolding when he was in kindergarten. I just watched the family, which I already knew very well and was connected to, and the child go through the process. And it was hugely, hugely eye-opening to me. I hadn't really understood that most homeless people in New York City were children and families. I think you have a kind of idea when you think of a quote unquote homeless person, and it's the people who are visible. And so this friendship sort of introduced me to this whole other world that was absolutely invisible and that I knew nothing about. I was initially just trying to help my son's friend's mother. And as I kind of got into it, I realized there was something she was missing. It was that the system was really not workable and non-functional. And probably the moment where I decided that I wanted to write about it was when the family was evicted. I knew that there would be this process where they had to go to this central intake center in New York City, and they had to wait. It's sort of like a DMV, but they would have to wait maybe for days in this center. And it was a school day. So I said, if you want to just leave your son here, we'll bring him to school. We live right by the school. My son would be delighted to have the sleepover, just to kind of let him maintain his routine and let him continue to attend school. And she said, no, they require all the kids go through this endless process. Like they all have to be there, meaning the city, like the Department of Homeless Services, is actually requiring the kids to miss school. And that just seemed so wild to me. And so just in the opposite of what any kind of a process that you would set up that would actually be helpful to kids and families. And so sort of from there, I began writing about it and just writing about all the different ways that students experiencing homelessness have their education interrupted.
Mm-hmm. Not to mention not being able to shield them from seeing or hearing all kinds of things. Who wants to see your parent who you want to think of as like really strong be shuttled from one window to the next, or crying, or,
Exactly. Like there's just some really obvious ways that the process could be less traumatic. And it doesn't seem like there's a lot of, or any thought put into that. And a lot of times some of the choices seem counter to that. So initially I wanted to write about how experiencing homelessness, how it impacts all students all around America. And I talked to people in Montana, and lots of other places. But as I kind of got into the weeds, it started to become clear that New York City was just its own category, and that the rest of the country would sort of require a different article. So that first story I did was maybe 9 or 10,000 words long, and it was just about New York City. And then this story, I focused on the kind of unique challenges that face kids in rural areas.
Before we get to the story, one thing I wanted to ask you about, there's a movement to say unhoused instead of homeless. Did you think at all about that, or did you consider using unhoused, or why not?
So I'll say I'm not an expert in all the different issues around the terminology. Mm-hmm. It did come up, and one of the advocates that I work closely with, she said that she was not a fan of that phrase for a few reasons. One, because she thought it kind of distances you a little bit from the actual issue, meaning lots of people don't have houses. She was saying she lives in an apartment, and the issue is really not having a home. And she also said, I guess, that maybe the issue, the motivation behind using the term unhoused is that it's less stigmatizing, but that she didn't, for her, I mean, as an advocate in this field for more than 20 years, she didn't see that it was somehow less stigmatizing than the phrase homeless.
Mm-hmm. I kind of seen the word unhoused as more, I guess, more clinical, or it feels more academic to me. And so it feels a little more removed, and homeless seems more visceral.
Yeah. I guess I like to lean towards the words that people understand more clearly. And so it felt that way, that word felt, homeless felt like a word that everyone understands.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just bursting with questions, Samantha. Why did you set the story in Ohio? And homelessness disproportionately impacts children of color or people of color. And so I was wondering whether you deliberately looked for characters that weren't African American or Latino or basically minority groups.
Mm-hmm. Well, all of the kids in my New York City story were children of color. And although you are correct that homelessness disproportionately impacts kids of color, I think one thing I was hoping to convey in the story was the sheer prevalence. And so I was not setting out to find children who were not children of color. I went to Ohio for a very specific set of reasons, and all of the people I met happened to be white. Because that's where I was. But it wasn't like I was setting out to find white kids.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And why Ohio instead of, say, like you said, Montana?
I actually initially thought about Montana, and my editor was less interested in that. And she was less interested because some of the issues that people were facing there had to do with wealthy people moving into rural areas during the pandemic. And she, I think correctly, didn't want the story to seem like, oh, it's a new problem, like as a result of the pandemic or something, but more that it's a systemic problem, that it's everywhere. So actually, I had considered Montana. But the reason that I chose Ohio is primarily because it was about a reporting issue, which is it's really hard to report intimately on children and families who are kind of in crisis and who are transient and who don't have a fixed location and who don't have often a phone number, Mm-hmm. So in New York City, I tried a bunch of different things before I settled on something that worked for me, which was this intake center that I mentioned. Journalists aren't allowed in it, obviously, but it's on the street. So you can just stand on the street and you can talk to people, and 1 out of 10 people is going to want to talk to you, and that was how I met families. But in rural America, there's not an intake center. There's not one place you can go and just hope to find somebody experiencing homelessness. And as I said, it's an invisible problem. So I knew I wasn't going to be able to do it without help. And so I really chose Ohio because some of the people that I spoke with on the phone, I felt that they would really help me, and they were invested in the story, and that they were interested in that they would help connect me to families, because there's no story without that.
Mm-hmm. You also wrote that you you interviewed a lot of people, including school officials, homeless advocates, students, and their families. How did you decide who to leave out?
There were some things like I spent a lot of time with this one mom and her kids, and I reported out, and it was a beautiful story, but then I lost her. She lost cell phone access, she lost her job, and she didn't have a fixed place to live. So there was no way. I made a big effort to find her, but in the end, I wasn't comfortable publishing the story, even if it was anonymized, without kind of checking back, because I think, and just on the basis of that one meeting. So she's not in the piece, which is a loss, because I think there were some really important things about her story. And in terms of how I chose anyone else, I mean, I was just looking for people who the moment that I found them in illustrated some of the problems that I knew were systemic and broader problems.
What is your process? Do you usually kind of speak to experts and academics and kind of get a bird's eye view of what's going on, and then you speak to kind of so-called regular people or people affected, or do you do both simultaneously?
Probably the former. I tend to talk. I tend to try to get a sense of what the bigger picture is and what the issues that people who are thinking about the subject from a public policy or academic standpoint think are the big issues, and then much later talk to kind of regular people. The talking to regular people in this case is really challenging. So I tend to spend a lot of time trying to set it up and tee it up and make sure that I'll get somewhere with it.
Oh, that was actually going to be my next question. Like, how many times did you visit and for how long? Because there are just such intimate details that people shared with you. And I thought this is when they're so vulnerable, the easiest thing would be to say no.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I started talking with Sandra Plants, who is the homeless liaison in that school district, probably in January or February. And she and I were discussing situations, kids she was working with. So I had a little bit of background then. And then I traveled to Ohio in April, and I covered a lot of ground. And then I traveled a third time just for 3 days, because there were certain, first I was coming to assist the photographer, because like I said, it's a pretty hard piece. But second, because there were certain loose ends and people I really wanted to meet that I just hadn't. And I got to I was really happy I did that, because that's where I got to do some reporting that probably wouldn't have made it into the piece if I hadn't been able to get that depth and meet people.
Some of the details you got was so heartbreaking. The $14 hair straightener a school administrator buys for a girl on the cheer team because she has nowhere to do her hair. One teen who walks around all night because he can't find anywhere to stay. And a coach who wants to help some of the children in a family by letting them stay with him and his wife, but he's told that would make it harder for them to get government help, as it would compromise their status as officially homeless. The details are just so beautiful. Were you asking for specifics as you went along?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the whole story lives in the details. And I think the whole challenge is to bring you into a situation and maybe also to understand. I think there's a sense of, quote unquote, I am using these air quotes a lot, homeless people as being, other or some unimaginable state. But in fact, it's just kind of like a spectrum. And I just kind of, I hope to kind of convey the prevalence and the widespreadness of the issue, and in a way the normalness that it's a part of our American life that people don't want to talk about, but it is a part of our life.
Mm-hmm. You wrote about two brothers struggling with homelessness, and they played football in a high school team on Coach Cooper's team. And you wrote, in writing that was very visual, sometimes they would stay after scrimmages with their mom, dad, little sister, and two younger brothers, helping Cooper's wife hand out hot dogs from a flowered crock pot until the sky streaked pink and the stadium lights popped on. Do you do that deliberately?
I guess, yeah. I mean, I think there's a way sometimes of writing about these kind of issues that, like I said, maybe others, the kids, or others, the situation. And I'm just, they're more than kind of the sum of their trauma. Like they have, they play amazing football games. They have, joys and triumphs and, the same kind of struggles that your own kids have. So I guess it's an intentional choice.
Can you read the part about the interaction between a child, Robert, and his mother, Norma? They're living in a motel room with another family. From Robert, his skinny chest.
Robert, his skinny chest bare under a blanket, asked Norma for a melatonin to fall asleep so he wouldn't be tired at school again. He had trouble sleeping at the Relax Inn because he said, "This doesn't feel like a home." He told Norma, "My teacher says if I fall asleep in math again, I'm going to get kicked out." "You're not going to school tomorrow," she replied softly. "Why?" Robert asked. "You don't have clothes for school," Norma said. There was a pause. Robert lay down, still wearing his glasses.
Do you remember being in that moment when it was happening? What was that like?
I mean, it was hard. It was painful to watch. And I think, like you said, hard to see, the parent being put in that position of sort of acknowledging a small defeat, I mean, it was the reporting with that particular set of families was particularly emotionally challenging, because I was very, I was in this room with them, and it was, so I was, there wasn't a lot of distance, and it was hard to just kind of observe and not, want to help or intervene in some way.
I've covered homelessness, the point in time count several times, and I've covered homelessness in schools many times, but it never occurred to me to compare the two statistics. You did, and you found a dramatic difference in the numbers.
Well, the truth is there are not great numbers about rural homeless students. It's not really broken out by rural or urban. And there's a couple data points, like quite some time ago, I want to say 2014, I may be incorrect about that. One organization in New York City, they broke it out and they said, oh, actually, although there are fewer numbers of students experiencing homelessness in rural areas, the rate is increasing much faster. But they only did it that one time. So you can't say that that's a fact. And actually, of the very limited numbers there's wild discrepancies between them. So I actually didn't feel like I had a lot of numbers to choose from. And I guess the one that you mentioned, the point in time count versus the one that the Department of Education compiles, for me, that's kind of the core of why I have focused on students experiencing homelessness, because in general, families and children experiencing homelessness are very invisible, and the entire sort of structure of the way that we look at homelessness is more geared towards single individuals. So you can't really understand the problem if you can't name the problem. And really the only organization that is consistently counting students experiencing homelessness is schools. And they're doing it in a way that everyone acknowledges is an undercount and is imperfect. It is not a great, they're not producing great data, but the data they're producing feels really valuable because, like, as you've noted, there's such a big difference between the number they come up with and the number that HUD comes up with.
Mm-hmm. And at least it's something.
Yes. And I feel like if you can understand, if you look at the data that schools compile, it is a better way to understand America's housing crisis, because it gives you a sense of how widespread it is, that other data points don't.
One child you kind of ended with didn't graduate. Did you think about ending with a more hopeful message?
Oh, I actually felt like it was hopeful. That's funny. So I guess no is the answer. I thought I was ending on a hopeful note because he was still trying and trying against such odds. And I thought it was a way to kind of circle back to the importance of the topic. Like, it was so important to him to try to get that high school diploma. And yeah, to me, it actually was I guess hopeful is a little too extreme of a word, but yeah, I think I felt like I was ending on a more positive note.
Oh. I guess I saw, once a child graduates from high school, then so many supports are kind of stripped away. Mm-hmm. And I feel like oftentimes, especially with young boys, young men, people kind of see it as like, well, you're not a child, you're an adult. And, mm-hmm. and whereas when a child is like much younger, a lot of people want to help. And then that kind of, so I guess I didn't see it as hopeful because I thought, one, it's going to be much harder, even if he wants to. And the odds are so against him. Like, it's just so unfair.
I guess the truth is that I felt fairly hopeless about many of the stories, and certainly about the bigger picture. So I don't know that it would be really accurate for it to be a hopeful piece. It's a sad story.
I remember listening to Catherine Boo speak once, the author of Beyond the Beautiful Forevers. Mm-hmm. And she said that oftentimes journalists who cover poverty, want to wrap the story up in a really nice little bow at the end, mm-hmm. and say, like, it's all fine. And she said that's actually doing the story a disservice, because then people think, like, it's all fine, like, so I don't need to do anything. She urged poverty journalists, like, not to do that, to kind of show it as it is, sort of the way you did.
Yeah, I think that that was definitely something that I thought about, just in terms of including Sandra Plants, the homeless liaison, because she's working so hard and so doggedly, and it is a sign of hope, but I kind of didn't want to hit it too hard, and I didn't want the reader to say, oh, well, we have this problem, but every school has a Sandra Plant solving the problem. And I was definitely looking to strike that balance. There are a lot of homeless liaisons like her, but there are plenty of schools that just have no resources at all.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought it back to Sandra Plants, because as I was reading it, I thought to myself, I'm so glad I'm living in the same world as her, like people like her who are just so amazing. But I want to give you the last thought. What is the one thing, Samantha, that you'll take away from this experience, or you want education reporters to take away from your piece?
Well, I mean, I think for me that a big takeaway was that schools are, and Sandra Plants is part of that, are being asked to solve this problem, not exactly solve it, but to in some way
manage it.
A problem that really has like origins that originates in places completely outside of schools, and is in fact really beyond the scope of what they can do. And the reason that the families I wrote about were in the situations that they were have to do with issues around transportation, childcare, affordable housing, wage inequality. And because we don't really have a system where you have a right to housing or income, but you do have a right to a seat at a public school, it's like all these issues kind of converge around public schools, because that's sort of a place where you have a right. And so I hope that people see that while having schools be involved is really important and critical, like, they can't be the solution to this issue.
We've been talking with Samantha Shapiro. Samantha, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
You can follow her on Twitter at Ms._Sam Shapiro. That wraps up this episode of EWA Radio. I'm Kavitha Cardoza. Do you have any questions for Samantha Shapiro? Let's continue the conversation on Twitter @EdWriters. Special thanks to Angelina Liu and Kristan Obang from EWA and Raul Garcia for production assistance. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening and lifting up education journalism.